Hello and welcome. My name is Beverly Popek, and I'm a Supervising Compliance Officer at the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement with the City and County of San Francisco. Our office is here to help you understand your labor compliance requirements. This is part 3 of our video series for city contractors who have agreements with us, the City and County of San Francisco. By the end of this presentation, you will be able to identify positions and the relevant labor laws and make that ultimate list of labor requirements per labor law for each employee and each location. To get the most out of this video, you should have already watched part 1, which was an introduction video. If you have employees in the City and County of San Francisco, you should have watched part 2, which went through contract versus citywide labor laws to help you understand the interaction. Please note that if you're operating outside of the City and County of San Francisco, for example, at the San Francisco International Airport, you don't have to watch the part 2 video. Throughout this process, I've been showing you how to create and refine a list of relevant labor laws as I've added more and more information on you. So have your most current list available, as you will need to add information presented in this video. Lastly, print the presentation slides that accompany this video so you can follow along and take notes. Let's focus on the reason we are here. You need to create an ultimate list that will define which labor laws you need to comply with per employee and per location. To get there, you need to determine which labor laws you must comply with. And we covered this information back in part 1. And back in part 1, you were probably super overwhelmed. So hearing this another time and the final time is really going to bring it all together. So this is where you have to start. First, you must review your contract to determine the labor laws and positions that are involved. As you're doing that, think and make note of the following on your list. For example, what is your scope of work? What were you hired to do? What is mentioned and what is said in the contract? With the scope of work in mind, what sort of positions or jobs are involved with this? And then where will the work be performed? This can be multiple locations. So let's go through an example. Let's say the City and County of San Francisco hired your company to create a software in the cloud. So when we think about software and the cloud, we always think about programmers. So yeah, there's programmers, but more than just programmers. We have all sorts of jobs and positions that aren't programmers. So for example, we have people that will interface with the city to understand user interface features and functionality we'd like to have, maybe reporting, maybe the look and feel that the software should have. That is all received, done by people who just aren't programmers sometimes, and most of the times. In addition, there could be testers. Testers don't exactly have to be the programmers. And what I'm saying here is that although the scope of work seems super simple, there's a lot of jobs and positions involved. And they don't have to be all performed in the same location. There can be multiple locations. Make note of this, and as you review your contract, think about this because for my example, the software, it falls under professional services. And under professional services and a professional services contract and this type of work, construction laws such as prevailing wage chapter 6 is not going to be relevant. So you'll see it listed in your contract, but it's not going to be relevant to you. You're going to have to review it and remember and take notes. And as you're trying to figure it out, please keep in mind that you can go directly to the on-demand videos for each of the contract labor laws. You can also go to each of the laws web pages to help you determine which laws are relevant to you. Using the list that you've created and that you're really refining per the review of your contract with those things kept in mind. Get information on each law to really determine if you are a covered employer. So ask yourself that. Don't automatically assume you are. That's great. That's a great start. But see if you are a covered employer. And if you are a covered employer, the next thing you need to ask yourself is, do you have any covered employees? Per each ordinance, there's a specific definition to that. And if you do have a covered employee or covered employees, who are they? Identify them, make a list. I would put a note on where they're performing the work. Now, once you have that, you're going to modify and create a final list that will clearly show the labor laws you must comply with. And per labor law, what positions and people, and now we're putting names, we should put names to the people, fall under which laws. Because your human resource and also your benefits and payroll department will need this information, because perhaps these people who fall under these contract laws are going to receive different wages and benefits per your contract with the city and county of San Francisco. This is very common in government contracts. And of course, you're going to put information about the requirements and options of compliance. Here is an example. This is my first example, and this is really following up on the example I started with some sort of software in the cloud, a professional services contract. So this list, this first cut list, will work for almost any professional services contract. So more than just software and programming, it could be for nonprofit services, office administration, architects and engineers, medical services, the list can go on. If it's not covered under prevailing wage, one of the prevailing wage chapter 6 or chapter 21, uh, this is kind of the generic list that you can look at as an example. So let's go back to that software example. And looking at the software contract with the city and county of San Francisco, we would see prevailing wage and then MCO, HCO, all these labor laws. And as I said, prevailing wage, Chapter 6 is for construction services. Software, computer stuff is not construction, so definitely not relevant and not applicable. If you go through prevailing wage, Chapter 21, miscellaneous, all of that stuff, not applicable. No, not the work you're going to be provided in this example. And when you look at it, it's going to be the minimum compensation, healthcare accountability ordinances, and then we always have this fair chance ordinance and salary history ordinance. Then we come to the part that concludes the contract labor laws requirement. Now we come to this part where you have to ask yourself, will the work you're going to be performing and will you operate in the city and county of San Francisco? If the answer is yes, then you must contemplate whether or not you have to comply with our citywide labor laws. If that is the case, then you must contemplate if you have to comply with the healthcare security ordinance, family-friendly workplace ordinance, paid parental leave ordinance, and lactation in the workplace. And then for all of these, as I mentioned, as you look into them, are you a covered employer? If so, do you have covered employees? If yes, who are they? Options or requirements? That is what you ultimately will need to know. Now, this is example 2. What if you have a generic sort of construction services contract? And right off the bat, for people not involved in construction, you might think, oh, this is super simple, but it's a lot more nuanced than you think. So construction contract, performing construction work, if you look at the contract with the city and county of San Francisco, it's everything under the sun and it may even apply to you. So let's take a look at this example. If you're performing, your employees performing construction work, construction type services, Chapter 6 prevailing wage would apply to those employees. Now, what if in that city contract, which is some sort of generic construction services contract, we would like you to provide some sort of security services around the construction site. That can be a fence with security guards. If that's so, and we're hiring you, the prime, to take care of all that, you're gonna provide security guard services, probably through a subcontractor, and the prevailing wage law for security guard services would be prevailing wage chapter 21. So share this information with any and all of your subcontractors. Make sure they're performing the specific when they're performing their work, they understand the specific labor laws that are relevant to them, just like you're understanding this. Now, for people not performing construction work, we have a lot of people in the construction services contract that would fall under minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinance. So let's dive into that. So, for example, office administrators, office people, clerks, the people who upload and do data entry for certified payroll, which is a requirement of prevailing wage. That takes a lot of time. And you know what? That type of work does not fall under prevailing wage. It's a professional services type of work, and that falls under the minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinance. Construction managers do work on the construction site, but they are not covered under any prevailing wage requirements. So they're covered under minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinance. Schedulers, architects, engineers. So if you have design and build, you can see where the professional services and the minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinance may apply only to those positions, those jobs, and of course, those people. We also have, under the contract laws, a fair chance ordinance and salary history ordinance. That concludes the contract labor laws section. And then you must ask yourself, well, will you be performing work in the city and county of San Francisco? If the answer is yes, for those people that are performing work in the city and county of San Francisco, you have to contemplate the other ordinances such as the healthcare security ordinance, and you have to add on the family-friendly workplace ordinance, paid parental leave ordinance, and lactation in the workplace. So this can be complicated. What if my administrator for a construction project, and the construction project is construction work in the city and county of San Francisco, but my administrator is across the bay outside of the city and county of San Francisco in Oakland? What labor laws would that administrator you would need to follow for that person? Um, they're not operating the city and county of San Francisco, but their administrator doing prevailing wage, LCP tracker, certified payroll work. It would be the minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinance. Those would be the two main laws in terms of wages, time off, and health benefits for an administrator in my example. So that's just giving you information of how nuances can be. So let's move on to our next slide. Now, what if you are a lease? The City and County of San Francisco has leases within the City and County of San Francisco and outside of the city. So, for example, the San Francisco International Airport. So, if you have a lease, the process is very similar. You must review your lease agreement to determine which laws are required per your contract. And you will note, because our leases are pretty much canned, there's a lot of things that are very similar, but sometimes different. So just look at the lease and it will give you the long list of laws. But which ones are relevant to you, you're going to have to figure that out based upon what's happening at your location. So if you are leasing, you're going to use the facility, most likely it's going to be something that is not prevailing wage. Now, if you are leasing the facility and you're renovating and you're going to do some improvement to the property, then prevailing wage would apply. And most likely, if you're leasing the property, you're going to hire a company to do the renovation work, the construction. So you have to make sure your subcontractor, that company you hire, understands prevailing wage, and they're going to comply with that because you are responsible for compliance, their compliance. So just like before, your agreement is a lease. You need to make a list of the requirements, and you have to figure out what's relevant to you, and ultimately, are you a covered employer? And if you are a covered employer, do you have any covered employees? If so, and who are they? You should be very specific. So here is my first example under the lease scenario. This is a first cut draft list for a lease at the San Francisco International Airport. And under the contract, the lease contract, we have minimum compensation, healthcare accountability ordinance, and prevailing wage. And you're probably wondering, yeah, that's everything under the sun. So what is relevant to what? It really depends on what you're doing on the property. For the most part, as I said in the previous slide, you're leasing the location, and if you have a food or retail concessionaire storefront location, the minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinance would apply to you. So sales representatives, accountants that are working on site, administrators like the manager, the cooks, the wait staff, cashiers, they all fall under the minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinance. Prevailing wage chapter 6 would apply if people are performing construction. In other words, renovating, getting the space ready, that is where that would apply, and that would be under your lease. So that concludes the contract labor laws for the San Francisco International Airport lease example. And here is most importantly the information about citywide labor laws. The San Francisco International Airport is not located in the city and county of San Francisco, so citywide labor laws don't apply. So you don't have to worry about that or look into that further. For companies who are operating in the city and county of San Francisco, and they have a location at the airport, this can be rather confusing. So slow down and definitely take a look and make your lists and get organized. And if you can't figure it out, we're here to help you. Here is example number 2. This is a draft list for a lease with the Port of San Francisco. And the Port of San Francisco has lots of waterfront offices and spaces to lease. And what you need to do is the exact same thing that I've mentioned before. Review your agreement, review your contract. And this particular one, it's a lease. It's a lease with the Port of San Francisco. And what you're going to see is a little bit different because for this type of lease, if you really look at the port, you'll have your prevailing wage requirement. That's, of course, if you're performing construction rehab on the site. But what you're going to find is that you're only going to see the healthcare accountability ordinance. And that applies to the same type of employees that we mentioned before at the airport, administrators, sales reps, cooks, and cashiers. And then, of course, we have the Fair Chance Ordinance and Salary History Ordinance. For the wages, you're going to have to look at the citywide labor laws. And the citywide labor laws apply to all of the Port of San Francisco leases because all of the port properties are within the city and county of San Francisco. So the minimum wage ordinance applies. Also, the paid sick leave ordinance does apply. Now, you may have to contemplate between the two different healthcare laws of your contract requirement, which is the healthcare accountability ordinance, and the citywide requirement of healthcare security ordinance per employee, depending on how many hours per week the employee is working. Take a look at video 2 if this is sounding confusing, and then, of course, if this is your scenario. paid parental leave, and rounds up the list comply with for this particular example of having a lease with the Port of San Francisco. So here are some last tips and best practices and things to remember. If you follow the methodology and information the series has provided, you will be able to make that ultimate list of labor laws for all positions performing work on the contract. And this is what you're looking for. Remember that your contract will allow you to figure out the contract laws that are listed and that are required. And then you're going to have to really drill down and figure out, are they relevant to you? And if they are relevant to you, ask yourself if you are a covered employer, and if you are a covered employer, do you have covered employees? And if the answer is yes, you have covered employees, you should certainly define them, figure out who they are, and put it down on a list to stay organized. On top of that, or after that, you have to ask yourself if you're performing work for the contract and operating in the city and county of San Francisco. If that is so, you may have this interaction of contract and citywide labor laws to analyze and contend with. So if you need to get more information about that interaction between contract and citywide labor laws and figure out which ones apply, refer to part 2. That video and slide would be a refresher or the information you seek. Once you have a list of labor laws, just really determine again if you're covered employer, covered employees, and finally, you have a lot of resources that are available to you. The Video on Demand Library is a great resource to get information, but our OLSC website has information on every single labor law. And our helpful staff they're also here to help you via telephone and by email. We've reached the end of this presentation and our series to help you understand the contract and citywide labor laws for city contractors. Our OLSC website is the best and ultimate resource you can navigate to because we have all of our labor laws and lots of information. Start there and I'm sure you will find the answer you seek. If you'd like to reach someone who can assist you in understanding your overall labor law requirements and this interaction between all of the contract and citywide labor laws, please feel free to contact the MCO and HCAO unit. But if you do have specific questions about a specific law, go ahead and contact that unit directly and staff will be able to assist you. Thank you again for joining me. And thank you for being a proactive employer to understand your compliance requirements.